If this is your first time here, the channel has more. Elden Ring, Bloodborne and more. All narrated slowly for nights like this one. Subscribe to Midnight Lore and let the next story find you. Get comfortable. Let the world outside go quiet. The Dark Souls universe begins before the concept of beginning had any meaning. Before time existed. Before the categories of life and death had been established as separate things. Before light and darkness were distinct from each other. The opening cinematic of the first Dark Souls game says it in 12 words that are among the most evocative in the history of video game storytelling. In the Age of Ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded in fog. That is where we start, in the fog. The Age of Ancients is a period so remote that the game gives us almost nothing concrete about it, and the sparseness is deliberate. What existed was grey crags, arch trees, enormous stone-like trees that reached toward a sky without sun. A world that was neither hot nor cold, and neither bright nor dark, because the categories that would produce those distinctions had not yet been established. Time may not have flowed in the way we understand it. The everlasting dragons that ruled this age may have been everlasting, not simply in the sense of being long-lived, but in the more literal sense of existing outside of time. Beings for whom aging and death were concepts that had not yet been invented, because the force that would introduce those concepts had not yet appeared. The dragons are not what you might imagine when you first hear the word. They were not breathing fire and hoarding gold. They were something more fundamental than that. Stone-scaled, ancient, the natural lords of a world that had no other kind of lord. Their scales made them effectively invulnerable to the forces that would later threaten them, and they reproduced after a fashion. They spread. The world was theirs not through conquest or violence, but simply through the absence of anything else capable of challenging their existence. And beneath the grey world, something happened. The first flame appeared. Where it came from is one of the questions Dark Souls declines to answer. It simply arose. A fire that was not merely physical, but cosmological. A fire that introduced into the world the dichotomies that would define everything that followed. Where before there had been only grey and fog and the absence of distinction, the first flame brought heat and cold, light and dark, life and death. It brought, in the most fundamental sense, the possibility of change. The world had been static. The first flame made it dynamic, and drawn to this fire came beings who would discover within it something extraordinary. Lord Souls. The Lord Souls were fragments of the first flame's power, crystallized into forms that could be held by individual beings and that would grant those beings extraordinary capabilities. Power over the fundamental forces that the first flame had introduced into the world. There were 3 beings who found and claimed Lord Souls, and one being whose relationship to the first flame was different from theirs in a way that would define everything. Gwyn claimed the Lord Soul of Light. He was the greatest of the 3, at least in the conventional sense of greatness. The most powerful, the most commanding, the being around whom the others would eventually organize. His soul gave him dominion over light and fire, and the specific radiant power that would eventually become the faith tradition of sunlight worship that persists through all 3 games. He was a warrior in the most absolute sense. He had nights before the war against the dragons began. He had plans. He had the specific quality of a being who knew what he wanted and understood that other beings would need to be organized around his vision of what the world should become. Nito claimed the Lord Soul of Death. He became the Grave Lord, the first of the dead, or the Lord of Death, depending on how you read his title. His domain was the grave and the tomb and the specific power over mortality that the first flame had introduced. In the world before fire, there had been no death, because there had been no life. Now both existed, and Nito was their sovereign in the darker half. He was already ancient when the others were finding their souls. Ancient in the specific way that beings associated with death are often presented as having always been there, as having predated the category they represent. His appearance in the game suggests something skeletal and enormous and collective, as though death itself had accumulated into a single enormous presence. The Witch of Izalith claimed the Lord Soul of Life. She was the counterpart to Nito. Where he governed death, she governed its opposite. The witch was a practitioner of flame sorcery, which she would develop into pyromancy, and her daughters were the most powerful fire-based mages in the world that was forming around the first flame. She was a mother figure in the most cosmic sense, the progenitor of a tradition of flame magic that would persist through all three games, and the person who would eventually make the most catastrophic mistake of the age through an act of genuine, if misguided, ambition. And then there was the Furtive Pygmy. The Furtive Pygmy is perhaps the most important character in the entire Dark Souls universe, and also the one most players know the least about. He appears in the opening cinematic as the smallest and most hesitant of the beings who approach the first flame. He is described as furtive, secretive, hidden, moving with the specific wariness of someone who knows they are less powerful than the beings around them, and has learned to compensate for this through caution and intelligence. He found the fourth Lord Soul, the Dark Soul. The Dark Soul was different from the others in its fundamental nature. The other Lord Souls gave their holders power over specific forces. Light, death, life. The Dark Soul gave its holder something more distributed, something harder to define. The Pygmy took the Dark Soul and did something with it that no other Lord Soul holder did. He fragmented it. He broke the Dark Soul into countless smaller pieces and distributed those pieces outward into the world. Each fragment became a spark of humanity, the specific quality that distinguishes human beings from the other creatures of the Dark Souls universe, the dark flame within every human person that the game calls humanity. This means that humans, in the Dark Souls universe, carry fragments of a Lord Soul inside them. Every human being is a vessel for a piece of the Dark Soul. This is what Carter, one of the primordial serpents, means when he tells the player that their ancestor found the Dark Soul. The player character is a human, and therefore a carrier of the Pygmy's distributed dark. The potential that humans possess. The potential to become a Dark Lord, to claim all the fragments of the Dark Soul and bring about the Age of Dark, is not something imposed on them from outside. It is their nature. It is what they are. The Pygmy hid himself in the darkness after this distribution. He waited. He had a plan that would take longer to execute than anyone else in the world would believe was possible. Now the war. Gwyn looked at the everlasting dragons and understood that they were incompatible with what the first flame had made possible. The age of fire required a world that could change, and that could experience the dichotomies of light and dark, life and death, heat and cold. The dragons, who were immune to these forces, who existed outside of time, were obstacles to the world becoming what it could become. He also had a crucial ally he did not expect. Seath the Scaleless was a dragon, but he was different from the others of his kind in a specific and painful way. He had no scales. The immortality of the everlasting dragons derived from their stone scales, the specific physical property that made them immune to the forces of the first flame. Seath, lacking this property, was mortal. He was a dragon who could die. In a civilization of immortal beings who defined their existence through their permanence, Seath was the outcast, the anomaly, the one who did not belong. He responded to this exclusion by doing something that would define his entire subsequent existence. He studied. He pursued knowledge with an obsessive intensity, trying to understand the crystalline structure of immortality that had been denied to him. His knowledge of dragon biology became more complete than anyone else's, and he turned it against his own kind. Seath betrayed the dragons. He shared with Gwyn what he knew about how they could be wounded, about the weaknesses in their apparently invulnerable defenses. With this knowledge, Gwyn developed lightning, the specific form of divine power that could penetrate dragon scales, that could strike and damage and eventually kill creatures who had been effectively unkillable before the first flame introduced the concept of death. The war was not quick. Gwyn's knights fought. The Witch of Izalith's daughters burned the arch trees. Nito spread his miasma of death through populations of dragons who had previously been immune to any concept of dying. Gwyn himself wielded his bolts of lightning against the most powerful of the stone dragons. The dragons fell, not all at once, and not without loss. The war was destructive in ways that are hinted at by the ruins and the broken geography of Lordran. But the outcome was decisive. The everlasting dragons were effectively destroyed as a civilization. A few survived in hidden places. Ash Lake, the area hidden behind double illusory walls in Blighttown, is a surviving fragment of the Age of Ancients, where a single ancient dragon called the Stone Dragon still exists. But the age of their dominance was over. Seath was rewarded for his betrayal. Gwyn elevated him to dukedom and granted him an archive in which to pursue his research into immortality. The research would eventually consume Seath entirely, driving him to the specific madness of a being who cannot accept his own mortality and who inflicts increasingly terrible experiments on others in pursuit of the secret that should, by his nature, be his birthright. He would eventually achieve a twisted form of immortality, but at the cost of everything recognizable as sanity or selfhood. With the dragons defeated, Gwyn established the Age of Fire. He built cities. He organized the world around the principles of the First Flame. His greatest city was Anorlondo, the city of the gods, an enormous construction of golden spires and vast halls that sat above the clouds, inhabited by Gwyn's family and the other divine beings who had aligned with him during the war. From Anorlondo, Gwyn ruled the world that the First Flame had made possible, and the world was, for a time, good. But the First Flame was always going to fade. This is the fundamental tragedy of the Dark Souls universe, and it is established in the very first minutes of the first game. The first flame was not eternal. It was a fire. Fires burn and eventually diminish. The age of fire was always going to end. The only question was when and what would come after. Gwyn knew this from the beginning, from the moment he understood what the first flame was and what the world it had made would become when the fire dimmed. Gwyn was afraid, not of death. He was a lord, and his relationship to death was different from a mortal's, and he was afraid of the dark, of the age of dark, of the humans and their fragment souls becoming what they were perhaps always destined to become. He built everything he could build in the time the first flame gave him, against the day when the fire began to fade, and then it started to fade anyway. Sleep well. The age of fire is in its golden hours, but the first signs of what is coming have already appeared. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. In the last part, we covered the world before time, the age of ancients, the dragons, the first flame, and the war that ended the age of grey fog and established the age of fire. Now we move into the age of fire itself, the long golden period of Gwyn's rule, and then the disasters that ended it. The age of fire was, by the standards of the Dark Souls universe, a good time. Gwyn built Anna Londo, the city of gods, raised on mountain peaks above the clouds, a place of golden spires and vast halls filled with divine light. His family populated this city, his firstborn son, a god of war who would eventually be erased from the annals for reasons the game only hints at. His daughter Guinevere, the princess of sunlight, whose image would later be used as a projection to deceive visiting undead, and his last son Gwendolyn, born with the power of moonlight and raised in unusual circumstances that the game handles with characteristic understatement. Nito retreated to the Tomb of Giants, the deep underground where the dead accumulated, and ruled from his catacombs as the Gravlord, spreading the concept of death through the world as the necessary counterpart to the life that the first flame had introduced. He was not malevolent exactly. He was what death requires, patient, absolute, and entirely without sentiment about the necessity of his function. The Witch of Izalith built her civilization underground in the city of Izalith, where her daughters practiced the flame sorcery that would eventually evolve into pyromancy. The Daughters of Chaos, 6 daughters who had each inherited fragments of their mother's soul and her gifts, were powerful and devoted, forming a coven of fire wielders who were among the most capable magical practitioners in the world that Gwyn's victory had established. And Seath sat in his duke's archives and conducted his experiments. Seath's obsession with immortality, with the specific quality that had been denied to him at birth, drove him to increasingly extreme methods of research. His experiments on the inhabitants of Lordran produced the channelers, human servants who collected special beings for his study. His research into the crystalline properties of immortality eventually produced his primordial crystal, which became the anchor for a specific form of immortality he achieved. Not the genuine timeless permanence of the old dragons, but a tethering of his existence to this physical object that prevented him from truly dying as long as the crystal remained intact. He went mad in the process. By the time the Chosen Undead encounters him, Seath is a gibbering crystalline terror, who attacks anything that enters his chamber without recognizing friend or foe. The brilliance that made him the most useful traitor in history had long since been consumed by the obsession it enabled. During this golden age, Gwyn made a specific administrative decision whose consequences would eventually be felt across all 3 Dark Souls games. And he had the humans, the beings who carried the Dark Souls fragments, separated from the gods and placed in the ringed city at the very end of the world, with his daughter Filianor sent to live among them as his representative. He did something to the Dark Souls expression in humans, creating the Dark Sign, a seal that bound the Dark Soul and prevented humans from accessing its full power. He was, in effect, suppressing what humans were capable of becoming, because what they were capable of becoming frightened him. The primordial serpents knew this. Carter and Frampt, the 2 great serpents whose relationship to events is one of the most fascinating threads in the series, each understood the situation in their own way and worked toward their own version of what should happen. Frampt had made a kind of peace with Gwyn's order and worked within it, directing undead toward the linking of the flame in ways that served the continuation of the Age of Fire. Carthy opposed this fundamentally. He believed the Age of Dark was the natural order, that the Dark Soul was humanity's birthright, and that Gwyn's interference was a perversion of what should be. Their conflict is never resolved cleanly, because the game presents both of their positions as containing genuine truth mixed with manipulation. And then the first flame began to fade. This was always going to happen. But when it began happening in earnest, the fear it produced in Gwyn, the specific terror of a being who had built his entire world on the continuation of something that was now visibly declining, drove decisions that made everything worse. He asked the Witch of Izalith to help. Specifically, he asked her to use her Lord Soul, her mastery of fire and life, to create a new first flame, to replicate the original source, to make something that would sustain the Age of Fire even as the original flame diminished. She tried. The attempt produced the flame of chaos, not the first flame, not a controlled replica, but something wild and voracious and fundamentally different from what had been intended. The flame of chaos consumed the witch herself. It consumed most of her daughters, transforming them into monstrous forms. Quelag and her sister the White Lady became half spider, half human creatures. The witch's only son was turned into the enormous ceaseless discharge, a being of constant burning agony who stands guardian over his sister's resting place without knowing why or having any capacity for understanding his own condition. The chaos flame spread through the city of Izalith, destroying it from below, transforming it into the ruin called Lost Izalith that the Chosen Undead eventually explores. Only one of the daughters escaped. Quelana fled the chaos flame and found refuge in Blighttown, where she became the teacher of pyromancy to any willing student, carrying the tradition of her mother's fire magic in a form that was not the dangerous chaos her mother had created, but that was tainted by the knowledge of what that chaos had done. She spent an age waiting, hoping that someone would eventually free her mother from what the chaos flame had made her. The bed of chaos is what the Witch of Izalith became. Not a person, not a god, not even a recognizable creature. A twisted biomechanical mass fused with her daughters the source from which all demons in the Dark Souls universe were born. The chaos flame that consumed her also produced the demon race, beings of fire and chaos who swarmed out of the ruins of Izalith and threatened the lands above. Gwyn sent his Black Knights to contain them. The Black Knights were burned black by the chaos demons in that campaign. The scorching is why their armor is black, why they are hollow remnants rather than living warriors by the time the Chosen Undead encounters them. Now, the Abyss. Deep beneath the human kingdom of Unkindled, a place of scholars and gentle magical practices, a city of light-based sorcery. There was darkness, the Abyss, and this was not a metaphor. It was a literal region of concentrated dark, the raw form of the Dark Soul's power, threatening to consume everything it touched. One of the primordial serpents, the evidence suggests it was Kati, though the game maintains some ambiguity, approached the people of Unkindled and manipulated them. He told them there was something in the dark beneath their city, something they should find. The people of Unkindled, curious scholars that they were, excavated. They dug into the Abyss, and in the dark beneath their city, they found a body. This body was Manus. Manus, father of the Abyss, is one of the most significant and most ambiguous figures in the series. The strongest interpretation, supported by the available lore, is that Manus was the furtive pygmy himself, or one of the primordial humans who carried the original Dark Soul in its most concentrated form. He had been buried long ago, in the period when Gwyn was managing the Age of Fire and suppressing the Dark Soul's influence in human beings. His burial was not death. The undead curse meant he could not truly die, but a kind of containment, an attempt to keep the most powerful expression of the Dark Soul from doing whatever it might naturally do if left uncontrolled. The people of Unkindled disturbed his tomb. They unearthed him. They experimented on him, trying to understand the darkness they had found, treating the ancient being as a research subject in the way that scholars sometimes treat things they do not fully understand. The suffering produced in Manus by these experiments caused his humanity, the fragment of the Dark Soul within him, to go wild. Uncontrolled humanity is something like madness expressed as a physical force. It spread outward from Manus like a plague, consuming the people of Unkindled, twisting them into the abominations called the humanity phantoms. It spread the Abyss throughout the city, corrupting everything it touched. Gwyn sent Artorias. Artorias, the Abyss Walker, was the greatest of Gwyn's 4 knights. Not the most powerful in pure combat terms, but the one with the specific quality that made him uniquely suited to this mission. He could walk in the Abyss. He could enter the darkness that consumed and corrupted everything else without being consumed himself. This was not something he did naturally. He had made a covenant with the creatures of the Abyss, a specific agreement that granted him passage through the dark, protection against the corruption that would unmake any other living being who tried to enter it. He went to Unkindled. He went into the Abyss. He found Manus, and he lost. The fight with Manus shattered Artorias' arm and broke his mind. In his last act before the corruption fully took him, he used his shield to protect his wolf companion Sif, the great wolf who guards his grave in Dark Souls, who fights the Chosen Undead with visible grief at what it is being asked to do. He protected the wolf, and then the Abyss finished the work it had started. Artorias, the Abyss Walker, died as himself protecting Sif, and became something else. A corrupted, raging remnant of what he had been, still moving, still fighting, still wearing the armor and carrying the sword of the knight he once was, but with nothing of the person remaining. When the Chosen Undead encounters him in the past, sent back through time by Manas's grasp, reaching through time itself, this is what they find: a legendary knight, hollowed by the darkness he dedicated his life to fighting, attacking the only person who might have saved him. Manas is eventually defeated, but his defeat does not simply end with his death. His soul shatters, and the pieces, his fragments of the dark soul, his concentrated dark, disperse across time and space. Each fragment eventually gains its own sentience. Each becomes a soul, a queen. The 4 queens of Dark Souls 2, Nashandra, Nadalia, Alsana, and Elana, are the fragments of Manus, scattered daughters of his shattered soul, each one an expression of one aspect of the primordial darkness he embodied. The lesson of Unkindled is the lesson that runs through the entire series. The abyss cannot be fought from outside. It can only be contained temporarily at enormous cost by beings who are willing to enter it, and those who enter it often do not return unchanged. With Izalith destroyed and the abyss temporarily contained, Gwyn faced the fading of the first flame without recourse. The witch who might have helped him was gone. The fire was going out, and Gwyn, who had built everything on its continuation, who had shaped the entire world around the premise that the age of fire would persist, made his final decision. He would link the flame himself. He took his knights, those who remained, into the kiln of the first flame. His knights were burned black by the process. Gwyn himself became the Lord of Cinder, a being who sacrifices themselves to the first flame to rekindle it, to extend the age of fire beyond its natural duration at the cost of whatever the sacrificed person was before. He sat at the heart of the flame and burned, not destroyed. The undead curse applies even to gods in its way, but burned hollow, his mind consumed by the fire he was sustaining, his soul fragmented by the process of giving himself to something larger than himself. The flame held. The age of fire continued for a while, but the cycle had begun. The first flame would fade again eventually, and when it did, someone would need to choose whether to link it again or let it go out. The Chosen Undead is the first person asked to make that choice. They will not be the last. Sleep well. We are arriving at the beginning of Dark Souls itself, the moment when the world you actually play in comes into focus. Welcome back. Let everything settle. The events of the first Dark Souls game take place long after everything we covered in Part 2. Gwyn linked the first flame. Time passed. The Age of Fire continued, sustained by his sacrifice, but diminishing slowly as all fires diminish. The undead curse spread across the world, and everything that follows from that point is where the game begins. The undead curse. The undead curse is the defining condition of the Dark Souls world by the time you arrive in it. Humans afflicted by the curse bear the dark sign, a dark brand on their skin that prevents them from truly dying. When a cursed human is killed, they simply return at the nearest bonfire. This sounds like a blessing. It is not. Each time a cursed human dies and returns, they lose something. Not their physical capabilities. Those return with the body. They lose humanity. The small flame of the dark soul within them, the fragment of the furtive pygmies distributed dark, grows dimmer with each death. And when it dims far enough, the person hollows. They lose their purpose, their memory, their sense of self. They become hollow, walking, fighting, existing, but no longer thinking in any meaningful sense. Not dead, not alive, hollowed. The gods and the institutions built around the gods' memory responded to the undead curse by creating undead asylums, places to lock away those bearing the dark sign, to contain them before they hollowed completely and became a threat to others. The undead asylums were not places of care, they were prisons. The curse was treated as a disease of character as much as a physical affliction, and those locked inside were expected to eventually hollow and be forgotten. The Chosen Undead begins their journey inside one of these asylums. How they came to be there, what their life was before the dark sign marked them, is never explained. Dark Souls is not a game about specific biography. It is a game about what a person does when they find themselves in a situation they did not choose, with no clear path forward, and no guarantee that forward is even the right direction. A mysterious figure drops a key into their cell. They escape. They fight their way through the undead asylum, encountering the asylum demon, a massive creature that serves as both a literal and thematic first obstacle, demonstrating that this world is hostile and that the Chosen Undead must learn to survive within it before they can do anything else. When they escape the asylum, a giant crow carries them to Lordran. Lordran, the land of the ancient gods, is a dying place. Anod Londo still stands, but most of the gods have abandoned it. The Silver Knights who once guarded it are hollow, going through the motions of defense without the minds that once directed them. The crestfallen warrior at Firelink Shrine, the first person the Chosen Undead meets, is himself a case study in advanced hollowing. Someone who once came to Lordran with purpose and watched that purpose corrode over years of failure until what remains is sardonic resignation. He warns the Chosen Undead that they will follow the same path. He is probably right about most people who pass through. But a prophecy exists, or something that resembles a prophecy, though even Frampt admits uncertainty about its nature. The Chosen Undead is said to be the one who will ring the bells of awakening, collect the Lord's souls, and succeed Gwyn as the next Lord of Cinder, relinking the first flame and extending the Age of Fire. The bells of awakening are located at opposite ends of Lordran, one at the top in the Undead Parish, one at the bottom in Blighttown past the Dark Swamp and the Toxic Valley. Ringing both bells brings Kingseeker Frampt to Firelink Shrine, where he confirms the Chosen Undead as the prophesied successor and directs them toward the next stage of the journey. What the journey reveals about Lordran is that everything Gwyn built is in various stages of decay and wrong. The catacombs beneath the earth are full of the bodies of the dead, animated by a necromancer named Pinwheel, who stole the rite of kindling and used it to preserve himself at enormous personal cost. The prison of the Crystal Cave holds Seath the Scaleless, now completely mad, still surrounded by his failed experiments, his immortality purchased at the cost of everything that made him more than a monster. The ruins of New Londo are submerged, the entire city flooded by the sealers, who drowned the entire population to contain the four kings after Kati corrupted them with the art of life drain. The four kings are what remains of the noble leaders of New Londo. Gwyn had granted them a portion of his soul as reward for their wisdom and foresight, recognizing them as the most capable humans in Lordran, the ones whose intelligence approached divine levels. Kati found them after Gwyn left to link the flame, and offered them power, the ability to drain the humanity from others, the Dark Wraith's specific gift. They took it. They became the Dark Wraiths, and the city they had built became a threat so severe that the only solution the Sealers could devise was to drown everyone in it, themselves included. The four kings in the abyss, the figures the Chosen Undead fights at the bottom of the flooded ruins, are barely recognizable as the rulers they once were. They are enormous, hollow, still carrying their crowns and the fragments of Gwyn's soul, but with nothing remaining of the people who received those gifts. This is what happens in the Dark Souls universe when beings built for light try to hold darkness. They do not transform darkness into light. They are consumed. Ascend's fortress stands as the final trial before Anor Londo, an ancient testing ground for undead seeking to prove their worth before they could approach the city of gods. Its architects built an elaborate trap system of falling boulders and swinging blades and pitfall rooms, populated by snake men who serve as guards. It is, in the context of the game's lore, a mechanism that Gwyn or his agents established specifically to filter out those undead who were strong enough to reach Anor Londo from those who were not. The City of Gods required a capable candidate. Sen's fortress was the selection process. Anor Londo itself is one of the game's most powerful environmental storytelling moments. After the darkness and decay of everything that came before it, Anor Londo is golden. Literally, architecturally golden, are enormous and sunbright and seemingly untouched by the corruption that has claimed the rest of Lordran. The great cathedral, the sweeping battlements, the silver knights moving through their eternal patrol routes. But it is empty. The gods have left. What remains is a performance of the city it once was, maintained by Gwyndolin, Gwyn's last son, the Dark Moon god who never left, who has used his illusion magic to project the image of his sister Guinevere large and warm and golden in the cathedral throne room, to create the impression of divine presence and divine approval for the Chosen Undead to receive the Lord Vessel. Guinevere's image tells the Chosen Undead to take the Lord Vessel, the container that will hold the Lord's souls, and eventually allow access to the Kiln of the First Flame, and to succeed Gwyn. As she says that Gwyn awaits in the Kiln. She says this is the Chosen Undead's destiny. She says it the way a projection of a departed goddess says things, with warmth that is entirely genuine in form and entirely absent in substance. If the player attacks this image, if they refuse the beautiful lie and strike the golden figure in her cathedral, Guinevere dissolves into light. The sun in Anor Londo goes out. The golden city becomes grey and night dark, and the truth of the place becomes visible. An enormous stage set, maintained by one lonely god who never left, who chose a lie he could believe in over an empty truth he could not. The Lord Souls, with the Lord Vessel, the Chosen Undead, has a purpose. Gather the souls of the ancient lords. Nito, in the Tomb of Giants, I has surrendered to the dark so completely that his entire environment is lightless. He exists in the deepest darkness, surrounded by the enormous skeletons of giants, tended by the necromancers who follow the Gravelord Covenant. He is not malevolent. He is simply what he is. The end of things, patient and absolute, doing his function. Defeating him takes something enormous from the world. It ends death's lordship without replacing it. The bed of chaos in lost Izalith yields the Witch of Izalith's Lord Soul, and the encounter with it is one of the game's most deliberately unsatisfying. There is no dramatic combat with a recognizable enemy. There is only a tangle of roots and chaos, the remnant of a god who tried to do something good, to help Gwyn, to preserve the Age of Fire, to solve a problem that seemed solvable, and failed completely. The fight feels wrong because the law demands that it feel wrong. There is nothing to defeat here, only something to end. Seath in the Duke's archives yields his portion of the Lord Soul, and the encounter with him requires destroying his primordial crystal first, the object his immortality is tethered to, before he can be truly defeated. His fate is the direct consequence of his brilliance misapplied. A dragon who wanted more than his nature allowed, who achieved it through betrayal and obsession, and who ended as a gibbering crystalline horror surrounded by the failed experiments that marked his path. And the four kings in the abyss yield the last fragment. The fight with them is conducted in the void. In the literal darkness of the abyss, with no ground visible and no light except what the player carries, the kings attack from every direction. More appear as the fight continues. It is, more than any other boss encounter in the game, a fight against the specific nature of the abyss. You cannot win by holding your ground. You can only win by going through. The choice. With all four Lord Souls collected, the Lord Vessel is filled, and the Kiln of the First Flame opens. The Chosen Undead walks through a world of grey ash, the ash of everything Gwyn burned when he sacrificed himself, and finds him. Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. He is hollow, the being who defied the dragons, who built Anor Londo, who shaped the entire Age of Fire and made the world what it became. He is hollow. His soul is the fuel for the fire he is sustaining. His mind is gone. What remains attacks the Chosen Undead with the specific mechanical ferocity of a great warrior who has lost everything except the muscle memory of combat. Defeating Gwyn is not a triumph. It is a mercy. He has been burning for uncountable years. The only thing left to do for him is end it. And then the Chosen Undead stands before the First Flame, which is fading, and must decide. Framt's answer, the answer of the gods and the established order, is to ling the flame, to sacrifice yourself to it as Gwyn did, to become the next Lord of Cinder and extend the Age of Fire, to maintain the cycle. Kathi's answer, available only to those who found him before placing the Lord Vessel, who descended into the abyss and heard his version of events, is to walk away, to become the Dark Lord, to allow the First Flame to go out and let the Age of Dark begin, the Age of humanity and the Dark Soul's full expression, the thing that Gwyn was afraid of and tried for an entire age to prevent. The game presents both choices. It does not endorse either. If you link the flame, a new Age of Fire begins. The Chosen Undead becomes the new Lord of Cinder, burning in the kiln, sustaining something that will fade again. Because all fires fade. Another cycle begins. If you walk away, the flame goes out. The screen goes dark. The game ends with darkness and a promise of what the Age of Dark might be, which is not shown, because the Age of Dark has never come, because someone has always linked the flame before it could. Neither choice is right, neither is wrong, and they are simply the two faces of the same impossible decision. Sustain something that is dying at enormous cost, or let it die and face whatever comes next. This choice, and the failure of both options to provide a clean answer, is the philosophical heart of Dark Souls. And Dark Souls 2, in a world that has cycled through this choice many times over, will explore what it means that the cycle never ends. Sleep well. The Age of Fire continues. For now. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. An enormous amount of time passes between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. Not years, not decades. The game explicitly tells you that the events you are entering happened so long after Lordran that the very names have been lost. That Gwyn and Nato and the Witch of Izalith are legends from a mythological past, so distant that most people in Drangleic have only the vaguest awareness that they existed at all. This is the first and most significant thing Dark Souls 2 tells you about the world. The cycle has run many times. The Chosen Undead made a choice. We do not know which choice, but the cycle continued. And another age passed, and another kingdom rose, and that kingdom fell, and another rose and fell, and eventually the world arrived at the state you encounter in the second game. Drangleic, the kingdom of Drangleic, was founded by Vendrick, a king of considerable ambition, genuine intelligence, and the specific kind of fatal flaw that Dark Souls reserves for people who are mostly good and entirely undone by one thing they cannot resist. His brother was Aldir, a scholar who retreated from the kingdom's affairs to conduct research in his keep, experiments whose specific nature was considered extreme even by the standards of a world that had already seen most things that could be called extreme. Vendrick built Drangleic into something remarkable, a civilization that had learned from the mistakes of its predecessors, that had achieved a degree of prosperity unusual for a world in which the first flames fading was a constant background threat. He understood the cycle. He understood that his kingdom, like every kingdom before it, would eventually face the undead curse, the hollowing, the choice of the flame. He had been trying to find a way to address this, not to link the flame and sustain the cycle, not to let it go out and embrace the Age of Dark, but to find a third option that no one had managed to identify. He was still searching for that third option when Nashandra arrived. Nashandra presented herself as a mysterious woman of extraordinary beauty who came to Vendrick with a warning. There was a civilization of giants across the northern sea who posed a mortal threat to Drangleic. She urged him to strike first, to invade the giants before they could invade him, to take their souls, their great and powerful souls, for Drangleic's protection and growth. Vendrick believed her. He loved her. He made her his queen and led his armies across the sea to the land of the giants. What happened there was not defense. It was conquest. Vendrick's forces invaded, pillaged, captured giants for experimentation, and returned with what Nashandra had really wanted: the giants' souls, and with them the knowledge to create enormous stone golems. that became the pillars and mechanisms of Drangleic Castle, the castle that Vendrick built as proof of his triumph, and as an affectionate gesture toward his new queen, was quite literally constructed by enslaved souls, the stripped essences of the beings his armies had subjugated. The giants eventually came back. They crossed the sea seeking vengeance, and the war that followed was the thing that broke Drangleic. It lasted generations. The giants' assault was methodical and devastating. By the time it was over, by the time the bearer of the curse, traveling into the giants' memories through ashen mist heart technology, killed the giant lord in the past, Drangleic was already a kingdom of ruins. The giants were defeated, but what they had shattered stayed shattered. And then the undead curse came. Drangleic's people began hollowing. The curse spread in ways Vendrick could not contain. He knew by this point that Nashandra had deceived him, that his wife, the queen he had loved, was not what she presented herself as. She was a fragment of Manus, one of the daughters of his broken soul, the primordial darkness that had been shattered in Unkindled and dispersed across time and space. She had found her way to Drangleic with a specific purpose: to reach the throne of Want, the seat of the First Flame's power, and use it to spread the dark as the original Manus had always sought to do. Vendrick, understanding this too late, did the only thing he could still do. He hid. He took the crucial elements of his kingdom's power, the giant souls, the king's ring, and scattered them or took them with him into the undead crypt, accompanied by his most loyal knight Velstad. He placed obstacles between Nashandra and what she needed. He denied her the victory she had manipulated him into arranging. And then he walked into the crypt and hollowed, slowly, until the bearer of the curse finds him. A giant empty figure, still wearing his crown, still moving through the crypt in the aimless patrol of a person who no longer remembers why they came here or what they were protecting. You can fight him. You do not have to. He does not initiate combat. He simply walks, hollow and enormous, through the crypt he chose to die in. The bearer of the curse, the protagonist of Dark Souls 2, is not the Chosen Undead. They are the bearer of the curse, a distinction that matters. The Chosen Undead had a prophecy, however manufactured and uncertain that prophecy might have been. The bearer of the curse has nothing. They came to Drangleic because they heard there was a cure to the undead curse here, a rumor that turned out to be partly true, and mostly a means by which the Emerald Herald, the mysterious woman who serves as the player's guide throughout the game, lured people with potential to Drangleic. The Emerald Herald is herself not simply a guide, as she was created, made from the blood of dragons by the scholars of Aldia's Keep, specifically for the purpose of finding someone capable of reaching the throne of Want and dealing with Nashandra. She is artificial, in the specific sense that she was designed for a function that she has been performing for longer than she can fully account for. She does not lie to the bearer of the curse, but she does not tell them everything, because everything would be too much for anyone to carry into this journey. The 4 great souls that the bearer of the curse must collect are not the same as the Lord souls of the first game exactly. They are powerful souls accumulated by the kingdoms and creatures that rose and fell across the cycles of fire and dark that preceded Drangleic. The game never specifies precisely how many cycles have come before. Enough that the names are gone. Enough that what remains are the residues of accumulated power, stripped of the specific persons who once held them. Aldia. Vendrick's brother is one of the most important figures in the Dark Souls series' ongoing philosophical project. He does not appear in the base game. He appears in the Scholar of the First Sin updated version as a presence that follows the bearer of the curse through the last stages of their journey. A voice speaking from bonfires and shadows, sometimes glimpsed as a burning, transformed figure that his experiments produced when he pushed too far in his search for truth. Aldia sought something specific, a way out of the cycle. Not the age of fire, not the age of dark, something else. Something that Vendrick called the third option, and that neither of them found within the conventional frameworks that Gwyn's world had provided. His conclusion, expressed in fragments of dialogue throughout the Scholar of the First Sin version, was that the curse itself was not natural. It was not a consequence of the first flames fading. It was, he believed, something imposed. A mechanism designed to keep humans cycling through the age of fire, always available as kindling, never free to become what the Dark Souls suggested they could be. The gods had not simply defended the age of fire. They had engineered humanity's inability to escape from it. Whether this is fully accurate, whether the undead curse is the natural consequence of Gwyn's linking the flame, or whether it was deliberately created to ensure the cycle continued, is one of the questions Dark Souls 2 raises and does not entirely resolve. What Aldia's presence does is make the question unavoidable. You cannot play through the Scholar of the First Sin without hearing someone articulate, clearly and without manipulation, that the situation the bearer of the curse is in is not the natural order. It is a designed imprisonment. Nashandra. The final confrontation, after the bearer of the curse defeats the Throne Watcher and Throne Defender guarding the approach to the First Flame, is with Nashandra. She drops the pretense. She reveals herself as a creature of dark, hungry for the power of the First Flame, using the bearer's journey to collect what she needed before betraying them at the moment of potential triumph. She is not simply a villain. She is Manas's daughter, a fragment of the primordial darkness, the concentrated dark soul that was broken in Ulasile. Her hunger for souls, her desire to spread the dark, her manipulation of Vendrick, and now of the bearer, these are expressions of what she is at the most fundamental level. She is the dark seeking to reclaim what Gwyn denied it. She is wrong in her methods and in the specific harm she causes, but she is not wrong that the dark soul is humanity's inheritance, that the cycle she is trying to end is a cycle that has cost more than it has given. After Nashandra is defeated, the bearer of the curse reaches the throne of want. And the same choice as Dark Souls 1. Link the flame and continue the cycle, or walk away and let it end. But in Scholar of the First Sin, there is a third option made visible. Aldia appears one final time. He asks, is linking the fire truly the only choice? He asks if you have found what lies beyond. He offers no answer because he found none himself. But he makes the question fully explicit. The binary of fire and dark is not the only possibility. There is something else. something that neither Vendrick nor Aldir nor anyone before them managed to reach. He then steps aside, and the bearer of the curse can walk away from the throne of want entirely, neither linking the flame nor embracing the dark, but leaving, walking out, into a world that has no age of fire and no age of dark, just the world itself, with whatever humans make of it. What this means for the cycle, whether walking away ends it, delays it, or simply refuses to participate in it without stopping its operation, Dark Souls 2 does not say. What it does is establish that the question of what lies beyond fire and dark is real, that it was being asked before Dark Souls 3, and that the answer to it, if there is one, is what the final game in the trilogy will need to find. Sleep well. The cycle turns. Drangleic falls into legend. And somewhere in the ash of what came before, the events of Dark Souls 3 are beginning to gather. Welcome back. Let everything slow. Dark Souls 3 begins with the end of something. Not the end of the world, though that is coming, but the end of a process that has sustained the world for longer than anyone still living can remember. The first flame is fading for the last time. How do we know it is the last time? Because of what the game shows you before you even move. The opening cinematic describes a world where the transitory lands have converged, where the places that house the great Lords of Cinder from across all the cycles have drifted together into one location called Lothric, as though geography itself is contracting as the fire dies, as though the world is pulling inward, collecting itself before its end. The bell tolls. The Lords of Cinder are unearthed. Our Lords of Cinder are what the beings who have linked the first flame become, or rather, what remains of them. To link the flame is to give yourself to it, to burn. What comes back from that burning is a husk of the person who went in, still charged with the fire they consumed, still functionally powerful, but hollowed in a specific way that is distinct from ordinary hollowing. They are the embers. They are what the fire leaves behind. 4 lords had been raised from their graves to link the flame one final time, to give what little remained in them back to the fire, and all 4 refused. The Abyss Watchers, the Undead Legion of Farron, warriors who had modelled themselves after Artorias the Abyss Walker, all drinking of wolf blood to bond their souls together in a shared purpose of hunting the abyss, had been Lords of Cinder as a collective, all of them linked together by the bond they had chosen. Resurrected now, they fought each other ceaselessly in the ruins of Farron Keep, unable to stop the internal conflict their soul bond produced in their hollow state, turning on each other in the darkness of the swamp they had once guarded. Yorm the giant was sitting on his throne in the ruins of the profaned capital waiting. He was the one lord who had known, going into his sacrifice, that he would be brought back. His friend Sigurd of Katarina had made a promise to him, that if Yorm was ever returned against his will and reduced to hollow violence, Sigurd would find him and put him to rest. Ihorm had left him a weapon specifically for this purpose, the Storm Ruler, knowing that the promise would eventually need to be kept. Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, had gone somewhere else entirely. Once a cleric who had devoured men, who had become so powerful through consumption that he was used as fuel for a linking of the flame, Aldrich had experienced visions during his time in the fire. Visions of a coming age of the deep sea. Not the abyss exactly, but something related to it. Something dark and oceanic and consuming. He had woken from his grave and gone to Anor Londo, the city of the gods, to eat them. He had already consumed Gwyndolin, Gwyn's last son, the dark moon god, who had maintained the illusion of Anor Londo for all the cycles since the original Dark Souls. Gwyndolin, who had outlasted everything, was being slowly consumed by a creature who interpreted visions as instructions and saw divinity as nutrition. And Lothric, the last of his line, the prince who was raised from birth to be the next Lord of Cinder, who had been educated and trained and prepared for nothing else, had simply refused. He sat with his elder brother Lorien, whose body was racked by a curse he had taken on his behalf, in the tower at the highest point of the kingdom that bore their family's name, and watched the fire fade from a distance. He did not fight the decision. He simply did not make it. Lothric's refusal is the event that starts Dark Souls 3, when the appointed Lord refused his destiny, when the system designed to sustain the cycle reached for the next piece and found it gone. The bell tolled. The unkindled rose. The unkindled. And unkindled is what results when an undead warrior tries to link the flame and fails so completely that even their ash is left behind. Not a Lord of Cinder. Not someone who made it all the way to the fire and burned successfully. Someone who burned without linking, who turned to ash before the connection could be made. They died as ash, and they rise from ash, and they are, in the game's own words, nameless, accursed undead, unfit even to be Cinder. The Ashen One, the unkindled protagonist of Dark Souls 3, is the last resort. Not the chosen one, not the prophesied hero, the last resort. If the Lords of Cinder will not return to their thrones willingly, they will be brought back as their cinders, as the ash and remnants of what they were, placed on the empty thrones to provide what substance they can for one final linking. And the Unkindled is the instrument of that collection. This framing is important. Dark Souls 1 gave you a prophecy that turned out to be manufactured. Dark Souls 2 gave you a guide who was using you. Dark Souls 3 gives you nothing, just the bare fact of what you are, which is ash, and what you must do, which is gather more ash from beings who have already given everything they had, and now must give the remnants of that too. Lothric itself is a dying kingdom. The undead settlement outside its walls is a place of misery and sacrifice, where the hollowing process has taken such a toll that the people who remain have developed a cult around it, sending their hollow to a pit where they pile up into something vast and wrong. The cathedral of the deep houses, the religion of Aldrich's vision, the deep, the formless, on the oceanic darkness, run by deacons who have been waiting for something they cannot entirely name. The catacombs of Carthus are full of bones and abyss. The Farron swamp is patrolled by the hollow remnants of the Legion that once fought against what lives there. Everything in Lothric is the end stage of a process that has been running too long. The Lords of Cinder, once defeated, return to their thrones in Firelink Shrine, the eternal hub of the Dark Souls universe, the place that exists between states, the bonfire that has been here across every cycle. Their ashes accumulate. The Ashen One grows stronger. and eventually the Kiln of the first flame opens. The Soul of Cinder, the guardian of the first flame in Dark Souls 3, is not a person. It is an accumulation. The Soul of Cinder is the manifestation of every Lord of Cinder who has ever linked the flame. Gwyn first among them, the Chosen Undead. If they chose to link it, every person across every cycle who sacrificed themselves to sustain the fire, they are all present in it. It is the collective memory of every sacrifice compressed into one guardian. Its combat style changes during the fight. It cycles through the weapons and techniques of previous lords. A straight sword phase, a pyromancy phase, a sorcery phase, a curved sword phase, as though every person who contributed to its existence is present and taking their turn. And in its final phase, it uses the moveset of Gwyn himself, the original, the first one. The person whose choice to sacrifice himself rather than let the fire go out started a cycle that has lasted uncountable ages. Defeating it means having outlasted everyone who came before you. It means being what the ash can produce when it has nothing left to lose. The 4 endings. Dark Souls 3 offers 4 possible conclusions. They are the fullest expression in the series of the question that has been building since the original game's 2 options. The first ending, link the first flame. The Ashen One touches the fire. The fire takes them. A brief, dim, exhausted age of fire is purchased at the cost of another person's complete self-immolation. The world is dark and dying. This tiny flame is the worst possible version of the Age of Fire, a pale echo of Gwyn's original vision, but it is fire, and it buys what it buys. The second ending, the end of fire. The Ashen One has given the Firekeeper eyes of the Firekeeper. Objects found in a hidden version of Firelink Shrine that exists in the past, before the fire fully dimmed, which allow her to see a world without fire. She is afraid of this vision, but she accepts it. After the Soul of Cinder is defeated, she is summoned, and she gently takes the first flame in her hands and lets it dissolve into darkness, into the specific dark that has been waiting since before Gwyn lit the fire the first time. The age that Gwyn feared, the age that the furtive pygmies distributed dark soul was always building toward. The Firekeeper says, but one day tiny flames will dance across the darkness. The darkness is not the end. It is what was always next. The third ending, the usurpation of fire. Through the quest line of Uria of Lundor and the Sable Church, a faction of hollows who believe that hollowing is not a disease but humanity's true form, the authentic expression of the dark soul without the Golden Order's suppression. The Ashen One accumulates dark sigils, the marks of the hollow. They go through a specific series of actions that ends with the Ashen One approaching the first flame, while marked by hollowing and absorbing it, not linking it, not ending it, taking it, becoming the Lord of Hollows, a being that contains both the fire and the dark, both the age of fire and the age of dark within themselves. The cycle does not continue because the fire has been consumed by the one who is supposed to sustain it. But the fire is not extinguished. It is simply somewhere new. The fourth ending. The Firekeeper is attacked in the moment when she holds the first flame, before she can let it dissolve. This ending has no official name and no achievement. It is simply what happens if the Ashen One, in the moment when hope for the world is held in someone else's hands, chooses violence. The fire is extinguished. the Firekeeper dies. What follows is not the gentle darkness of the end of fire ending, with its promise of tiny flames dancing in the future. It is something else. Whether it is worse or simply different, the game does not say. It ends. These 4 endings have been debated since the game's release. Which is the right one? Which is the true one? Whether the usurpation is the salvation that Vendrick and Aldia were searching for. The third path beyond fire and dark. Whether the end of fire is the gentle ending the world deserved after so many cycles of brutal sacrifice. Whether linking the flame one more time serves any purpose that makes the cost worthwhile. Miyazaki and From Software have not declared a canonical ending. The question is left open because the question is the point. After 3 games and an uncountable number of cycles, the Dark Souls series does not tell you what the right choice is. It tells you that the choice exists, that it has always existed, that every person who came before you made some version of it, and none of them got it definitively right. What the Ashen One is, finally, is not a hero or a villain or a chosen one, or even a last resort. They are the most recent person to stand at the fire and be asked what they believe the world deserves. Sleep well. The cycle is ending, or continuing, or being transformed into something that has no name yet. The choice is yours. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. Before the first flame, before Gwyn, before the age of ancients and the everlasting dragons. There is a theory, not confirmed, not official, but supported by enough evidence in the games that the community has largely accepted it as the most coherent framework, that the world the Dark Souls trilogy takes place in had a history even older than what the opening cinematic of Dark Souls describes. That history is Demon Souls. Demon Souls is not officially connected to Dark Souls. From Software has never stated that the 2 games share a canon universe. But when you play both and look at what they describe, the specific beings they reference, the weapons that appear in both, the architectural similarities between locations, and particularly the way Dark Souls 3's final DLC, the Ringed City, seems to reference the world of Demon Souls explicitly. The connections are too consistent to be purely accidental. This part treats Demon Souls as what many scholars of the series believe it to be. The earliest chapter of the same world's history, a glimpse of what existed before the first flame changed everything. The old one, before the first flame introduced fire and death and the dichotomies of light and dark, something else governed the world. The old one, an entity of unfathomable age and scale, a vast coiling creature made of trees and dark matter, patient and hungry and essentially unkillable, had been sleeping in the world since before any civilization existed. It was not evil in the way a person is evil. It simply was. It was hunger without moral dimension, a thing that existed to consume souls and grow larger, without any purpose beyond the continuation of its own appetite. The Old One is the source of what Demon Souls calls the soul arts, the magical tradition of manipulating souls directly, drawing on the primordial energy of consciousness and using it to perform feats that later ages would call sorcery and miracles. In Demon Souls, it is strongly suggested that even the religious traditions that call themselves the worship of God are actually, without knowing it, worshipping the Old One. The talisman of God is described as crafted in the image of God. The Talisman of Beasts is described as crafted in the image of the Old One. And the description of the Talisman of Beasts includes the statement, "The symbol of God was nothing more than the image of the Old One." If the religion of Boletaria is inadvertently worshipping the thing that threatens to consume it, then faith in the world of demon souls is not simply spirituality. It is Stockholm Syndrome applied to cosmology. The first Scourge. Long before the events of demon souls, in an ancient past that the game's monumentals describe only in the broadest terms, the Old One woke, not for the first time in its eternal existence, but for the first time in living human memory. The Monumentals, a group of powerful beings who had mastered the soul arts and become overseers of the world's stability, confronted it. The cost was catastrophic. Half the world was consumed by the deep fog, the colorless mist that the Old One projects when it wakes, which spreads across the land and produces demons to gather souls for their master. Innumerable lives were lost. The Monumentals managed eventually to lull the Old One back to sleep. Not kill it. The Old One cannot be killed. It can only be made to sleep again, and its sleep is purchased by denying it what it needs to sustain its waking state. Without souls to feed it, the Old One's hunger cannot be maintained at the level required for wakefulness. It subsides, it rests, but it does not end. In the aftermath of the first Scourge, the Monumentals banned the soul arts entirely. Their reasoning was that the soul arts were what had drawn the Old One to wakefulness in the first place, that the practice of soul manipulation created the psychic resonance that roused it from its ancient sleep. If no one practiced the soul arts, the Old One would stay dormant. The world could recover, life could continue, and they placed 6 archstones across the world, physical anchors that maintained the fabric of a reality that had been partially consumed, and the most powerful among them entombed themselves at the Nexus, binding their own existence to the maintenance of the space between worlds that the archstones created. They became the sacrificial guardians of a world that did not know it was being protected. The 5th archstone has a specific and peculiar status in the game. It is broken. The land it connected to, what would have been a 6th world for the player to explore, is simply gone. The archstone is shattered. What happened to the civilization connected to it is never explained. It is one of the great mysteries of demon souls, left deliberately unresolved, the suggestion of a catastrophe that preceded even the first Scourge. Boletaria and the second Scourge. Centuries or millennia after the first Scourge, after the world had recovered enough for new kingdoms to rise, the kingdom of Boletaria emerged. Its king was a Lant, a ruler of genuine greatness, a warrior and statesman, who built his kingdom into something remarkable through the specific combination of military capability, political wisdom, and personal courage that makes for the best kind of king in the kind of story where kings matter. Then he found the Nexus. The Nexus is the hub of demon souls, the space between worlds where the player character resides between their journeys into the fog-consumed lands of Boletaria. It sits at the intersection of the Archstones. And in the Nexus, Allant encountered the Maiden in Black, a demon of strange nature, one of the Old One's children, who had nevertheless been bound to the Nexus by the Monumentals as part of their protective arrangement. The maiden in black could teach the soul arts. She could show a person how to work with the fundamental energy of consciousness and life in ways that no ordinary magic could approach. Alan learned. He mastered the soul arts beyond what anyone since the monumentals themselves had achieved. And then, hungry for power beyond even what the soul arts could provide, he returned to the Nexus with the Soulbrand, one of the two ancient royal swords of Boletaria, infused with the essence of light, and woke the Old One himself. Why? Because he had seen enough of the world and its suffering to want it to end. Alan's motivation, as it becomes clear through the game, was not simple greed for power. It was a specific and terrible mercy. The belief that existence itself was too painful, that the Old One's consumption of all souls would be a form of release for a humanity that had suffered too much for too long. He had looked at the world clearly and concluded that the kindest thing he could do for it was help it stop. This is one of the most sophisticated villain motivations in any From Software game. Alan is not wrong that the world suffers. He is not wrong that the suffering is real and enormous. He is wrong that extinction is mercy. Or rather, the game does not tell you definitively that he is wrong, because it maintains, as all From Software games maintain, the ambiguity of whether any ending is truly better than the others. The second Scourge began. The deep fog spread across Boletaria. Demons appeared, are gathering souls for the waking Old One. Those who entered the fog were bound within it and could not leave. King Alan himself, consumed by the soul arts and the proximity to the Old One, became a hollowed thing, a flaccid creature that looked nothing like the powerful king he had been, found sitting at the heart of the Nexus's deepest point, waiting to be ended. The Slayer of Demons. The player character in Demon Souls is simply a warrior who entered the fog. They died. They woke in the Nexus. The maiden in black provided guidance. Destroy the demons. Deprive the Old One of the souls that sustain its wakefulness. Lull it back to sleep. The 5 worlds, connected by the Archstones, represent 5 different civilizations or regions consumed by the fog. Each one has its archdemon, a particularly powerful demon that must be defeated to reclaim the soul fragments needed to progress. Tower Latria with its God King, Stonefang Tunnel with its Forge Demon, the Shrine of Storms with its death-related dark, the Valley of Defilement with its plague and misery, and the saint who chose to stay among the suffering rather than leave. Saint Astrea is perhaps the most important figure in understanding Demon Soul's moral framework. She was a holy woman of genuine faith, someone who came to the Valley of Defilement, the most miserable and abandoned place in the fog-consumed world, specifically to give what comfort she could to the people trapped there. She allied with a demon. She accepted demon power because it was the only way to help the wretched inhabitants she had chosen to stay with. She believes, when the player confronts her, that what she did was right. She does not fight. She asks only that her guardian Garl Vinland be left unharmed. The player kills Garl to reach her. Then Astrea kills herself rather than be defeated. This is not a boss fight in any conventional sense. It is an execution. The game placing you in the position of killing someone who is clearly not your enemy, who has done something genuinely good with the power she accepted, because the system requires all demons to be destroyed regardless of their individual relationship to what that demon status means. The ending choice. After defeating all 5 archdemons, the Slayer of Demons enters the Old One itself. A vast dark space that is simultaneously an interior and an exterior, and the space inside a being so large that it functions as its own world. King Allan's remains are there, empty and small, all the greatness that made him a king consumed by what he chose. The maiden in black can put the Old One to sleep. She performs a lullaby, and the Old One subsides. Or the player can kill the maiden in black. Without her to lull the Old One, it stays awake. The player becomes its servant, the new instrument of soul consumption, the next figure in the position that Allan occupied. The world remains in the fog. The cycle of soul gathering continues. These 2 endings do not map neatly onto the fire and dark endings of the Dark Souls trilogy. They predate that framework entirely, but they establish the same core question. Is the answer to maintain the system that has existed, accepting its costs, or to abandon it and accept whatever alternative follows? And they establish that the answer to this question will not be obvious, and that every version of it involves someone being harmed. The connection to what follows. If Demon Souls is the earliest chapter of this world's history, then the Old One is what existed before the first flame. When the first flame appeared and introduced the dichotomy of light and dark, souls took on a new character. They became the currency of the Age of Fire rather than simply the food of the Old One. The Pygmy's fragmentation of the Dark Soul into humanity represents the dispersal of what the Old One had always consumed, now distributed into the very beings the world was built for. Patches appears in Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, and Bloodborne. The Storm Ruler weapon appears in both Demon Souls and Dark Souls 3. The architecture of Tower Latria in Demon Souls is reflected in Irithyll Dungeon in Dark Souls 3, with such precision that they share the same gargoyle designs. Yuria, the witch in Demon Souls, shares a voice actress with Yuria of Lundor in Dark Souls 3. The Profaned Flame, which is described in Dark Souls 3 as a fire that erupts from the sky when the rotted furtive pygmy was denied burial rites, connects the pygmy's primordial dark directly to a flame that cannot be controlled, which echoes the Old One's chaotic hunger. These are not proof of an official connection. They are the evidence that the people who made these games were always thinking of them as chapters of the same long story, whether or not they were permitted to say so. Sleep well. The first flame came after all of this. The Age of Ancients came after all of this. Everything you played in Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 is the later history of a world that started here, in the fog, with an old and hungry god and a king who thought ending the world was an act of mercy. Welcome back. Let everything slow around you. The Dark Souls trilogy's downloadable content is not simply additional content. The major DLCs, particularly Artorias of the Abyss for Dark Souls 1, the Crown DLCs for Dark Souls 2, and both Ashes of Ariandel and the Ringed City for Dark Souls 3. Each contributes something essential to the larger story. This part covers the most important of them, and what they reveal about the world's history and its possible future. Artorias of the Abyss. the story behind the legend. We covered the events of this DLC in Part 2, but it is worth returning to for what it reveals about how the Dark Souls universe handles history and memory. When the Chosen Undead is pulled back in time to Ulatsil, they do something that the world's legend has attributed to Artorias. They defeat Manus, save Princess Dusk, arm and protect Sif. Artorias himself is already corrupted when they arrive. The Chosen Undead must fight and kill him. His corrupted form, the fallen version of a knight who devoted his life to fighting the dark and was consumed by it at the end. When the Chosen Undead returns to their own time, the legend of Artorias remains intact. Artorias is remembered as the Abyss Walker who triumphed, not as the knight who was defeated and had to be put down by a nameless time traveler. The world's history has been written over with a heroic version of events that is more bearable than the truth. Princess Dusk, the only witness, was too disoriented to accurately report what happened. The Chosen Undead simply disappears, leaving no trace. The DLC establishes something that runs through the series as a recurring theme. The official version of history is almost always wrong in specific and meaningful ways. The heroism the world remembers is not what actually happened. The people who actually did what history credits to heroes are not the people history credits. The gap between what occurred and what is remembered is not accidental. It is managed by the living and by the dead, by people who understand that the truth is too destabilizing to be allowed to circulate freely. The Painted Worlds. Before covering the Dark Souls 3 DLC specifically, it is worth understanding what a painted world is, because it is one of the more unusual concepts in the series, and one that has been present from the very beginning. In Dark Souls 1, there is an area called the Painted World of Ariamis, a cold, snow-covered world inside a painting, accessible by being transported into it. Its inhabitant is Priscilla, a half-dragon born of unusual parentage, who asks the Chosen Undead to simply leave her be rather than fighting. She has been placed in the painting as a kind of exile, too dangerous or too unusual for the world outside, kept away from it by being put somewhere separate. A painted world is exactly what it sounds like. A world that exists within a painting, created by someone with the specific ability to make worlds habitable through their art. The painted worlds are refugees for those who have no place in the world outside. Cold, separate, self-contained, sustained by their own internal logic, rather than by the first flames fading or the age of dark's coming. And they are, in a specific sense, the closest thing to escape from the cycle that the series offers within its existing structure. Ashes of Ariandel. Slave Knight Gale first appears in the Cathedral of the Deep, kneeling near a bonfire. He is ancient, old in a way that most undead are not, worn down to something elemental and essential. He carries a scrap of a rotting painting, and he asks the Ashen One to enter it. The painted world of Ariandel is a world in decay. Its rot comes not from scarlet rot or from the abyss, but from the specific condition of a painted world whose creator is unable to do what needs to be done. Burn it. All painted worlds must eventually be burned. The flame is what cleanses the rot and makes space for something new. But the current guardian of Ariandel, Father Ariandel, and cannot bring himself to burn what he has spent his existence protecting. He flagellates himself instead, trying to sustain the world through his own blood, producing enough warmth to slow the rot without ever addressing its cause. Sister Frida, formerly Elfrida, one of the leaders of the Sable Church of Londor, who appeared in the main game as a mentor to Uria, has come to the painted world and convinced Ariandel that rot is better than flame. She knows that if the world burns, a new painting will be made. She does not want a new world. She wants this one, even rotting, because it is the only place she has ever found that felt like home. She abandoned the Sable Church and came here specifically to stop Ariandel from doing what must be done. When you defeat them, when Ariandel's grief and rage and Frida's desperate protectiveness are finally overcome, the painting begins to burn, and in the attic there is a young woman at a canvas. She is the painter. She can see the flame now. She knows what she needs to paint a new world. She only lacks one thing, a pigment, a specific color that does not exist in the current world, the color of the dark soul of humanity. She calls Gale uncle. She has been waiting for him to bring her what she needs, the Ringed City. Gale has been traveling through time, or something close to it, looking for the dark soul. The Ringed City DLC takes place at the literal end of the world, not the end of the Age of Fire, but the end of everything. The farthest point in time that the Dark Souls universe has ever shown, and the place where all the kingdoms and cycles have collapsed into a single pile of ruins called the Dreg Heap, where the weight of accumulated history has compressed the world into a final location. The Ringed City itself is where Gwyn sent the pygmies, the humans who carried the Dark Souls fragments. After the war against the dragons, after establishing the Golden Order, Gwyn gave his daughter Filianor to the Ringed City to keep watch over humanity's true nature. The Pygmy Lords there have been living in a specific kind of suspended time, maintained by Filianor's sleeping presence, their curse marking sealed by Gwyn's ring of binding that they all bear as an imposed gift. When the Ashen One arrives and touches the cracked egg in Filianore's lap, waking her from her endless sleep, time collapses. The present and the far future of the Ringed City become the same place. What surrounds you now is the most distant future the series shows. A vast ashen wasteland, the Ringed City crumbling and forgotten, the Pygmy Lords reduced to hollow remnants, waiting for the last of the Dark Soul to do whatever the last of the Dark Soul does, when there is nothing left to consume. And Gale is there. He has been killing Pygmy Lords for an unknown length of time, collecting the fragments of the Dark Soul from their dried and ancient blood. He has consumed so much of the Dark Soul that it is burning him from the inside, not corrupting him in the way the Abyss corrupts, but simply exceeding the capacity of any single being to contain. He has gone mad from the accumulated weight of all that dark. He faces the Ashen One and asks, or demands, or simply does what he must, for the Ashen One's soul. The fight that follows is among the most emotionally affecting in the series, precisely because of what Gale is. A faithful servant of a small girl who is waiting for paint that he has gathered at the cost of everything, including himself. He is not a villain. He is a person who took on too much and was broken by it, still moving, still fighting, because he cannot let himself stop until the task is finished. Defeating Gale leaves behind the blood of the Dark Soul. the collected essence of everything humanity has ever been, across all the cycles, compressed into a single vial of dark blood. It is the pigment the painter has been waiting for. Back in Arindel, with the fire burning, you bring the blood of the dark soul to the painter. She takes it gently. She thanks you. As she begins to paint, she says she will make a cold, dark, and very gentle place, a home for the forlorn, a place where those who have no place in the world outside can rest. If you give her your name, she says she will name the world after you. If you do not, she says she will name it Ash. The new painted world is the closest thing the Dark Souls universe has to a hopeful ending. Not the continuation of the cycle, not another linking, another sacrifice, another age of fire burning until it fades. Not the age of dark as Carthy envisioned it, the Dark Soul's dominion asserting itself over a lightless world. Something quieter and more specific, a place to rest, a world made by an artist who understands both fire and dark, who carries the knowledge of what both have cost, and who is making something new from that understanding. What happened between the DLCs? The two DLCs of Dark Souls 3 tell a single story, the quest for the Dark Souls pigment, but they are separated by the main game. You begin the first DLC before you know what the painter needs. You complete the second DLC in the far future, at the end of everything. Between them is the Ashen One's entire journey through Lothric, the defeat of the Soul of Cinder, the choice at the first flame. Whatever choice you make at the first flame, whatever ending you achieve in the main game. The world of Arindel burns. The world is at its end, and Gale has done what he needed to do. The new painted world is made regardless of which ending the Ashen One chooses. This is the most hopeful thing the DLCs do. They create something that exists outside the binary of fire and dark. The painter's world is neither. It is art. It is the specific act of making something new from the materials of what came before, from ash, from the blood of humanity's accumulated dark, from the knowledge of what fire costs and what darkness promises. The cycle of the Dark Souls universe may or may not end. The endings of DS3 are all ambiguous about what comes next, but in a cold world, at the end of everything, a small girl is painting, and she says that one day it will make someone a goodly home. Sleep well. The final part remains. The meaning of all of this is still to be considered. Welcome back. This is the last part. We have travelled from the age of ancients, the grey fog and the everlasting dragons, and the world before time had meaning. Through the first flame, the war against the dragons, the golden age of Anor Londo, the disasters of Izalith and Unkindled, Gwyn's sacrifice, the first cycle and the second and the third, and however many came between. Through Lordran and Drangleic and Lothric, through Boletaria before any of them, through the DLCs that extended the story into the far future and brought it to rest finally in the hands of a small girl painting by firelight in a cold world at the end of everything. This final part does not cover new events. It asks what all of these events mean, what the Dark Souls universe is trying to tell you through the specific shape it has given to its history. The fire is not good. The most important thing to understand about the fire in the Dark Souls universe is that it is not simply good. It is not the light that holds back evil darkness. It is not the force of civilization against barbarism. It is a specific power, with specific beneficiaries and specific costs, and those costs have been paid almost exclusively by people who did not choose them. Gwyn was afraid. Everything he built, the Golden Order, the suppression of the dark soul in human beings, the dark sign, the undead curse, the cycles of sacrifice that followed his linking of the first flame. Everything came from one initial act of fear. He looked at the Age of Dark and could not face it, and so he burned himself to prevent it, and in doing so created a cycle that forced thousands of others to burn in his wake, or to hollow in the attempt, or to spend their existence as kindling for something that was always going to fade. The fire is not evil. It gives real things, warmth, light, the specific qualities of civilization and order that distinguish Gwyn's age from the grey fog before it. But it is not good in the simple sense. It is something that a specific being chose to sustain at specific cost to specific others for reasons that were understandable but not necessarily right. The dark is not evil. Kati tells you this directly. The dark soul is humanity's inheritance. The Age of Dark is the natural order. What should have followed Gwyn's age without interference? What the furtive pygmy's fragmentation of the dark soul was building toward across all those cycles. Humans are, in the most fundamental sense of the dark soul's universe, and children of the dark. The warmth of the fire that they have been living under is borrowed and conditional, sustained by someone else's sacrifice and someone else's fear. But the dark is not simple freedom or justice either. Kate manipulates. The dark wraiths he created drain humanity from others without consent, taking by force what they claim is humanity's birthright. The Age of Dark, if it comes, is not a guaranteed age of human flourishing. It is simply the absence of the fire's suppression of what humans are. What humans make of that absence has never been demonstrated, because the cycle has always been interrupted before the Age of Dark could fully unfold. Manus, who embodied the dark soul in its most concentrated form, went mad from it. The fragments of his soul that became the daughters of Manus, Nashandra, and her sisters, pursued their goals through deception and manipulation. The dark soul's full expression in the world has not, in the evidence the games provide, produced anything obviously better than what the fire created. The dark is humanity's nature. That does not make humanity's nature good. The cycle and what it costs. The most devastating thing about the Dark Souls universe is not any individual catastrophe. It is the structure. The cycle of fire fading and being linked again, across multiple games, and implied countless more cycles beyond what the games show. This structure means that every sacrifice is temporary. Every hero who links the flame is burning for something that will need to be done again. Every person who hollows in the attempt is lost for a cause that will require the same loss from someone else later. Vendrick understood this. Aldia understood this. They were not wrong that the cycle was a problem. They were not wrong that linking the flame over and over was a kind of insanity. Doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting different results while the world grew a little older and a little more exhausted with each repetition. The question was never whether the cycle should end. The question was how. Aldia's answer was to find the third option. Something beyond fire and dark. Something that acknowledged the legitimacy of both without submitting to either's terms. He failed. But the question he asked survived him, And it is the question that the DLCs answer in the only way the series knows how to answer anything. Not with a declaration, but with an image. A girl painting by firelight. A world made of cold and dark and gentleness. Not the age of fire. Not the age of dark. Something human. The specific act of making, of choosing what to create from the materials of what has already been destroyed. The bonfires. Throughout the entire Dark Souls series, the bonfire has been the point of stability. Every time you rest at a bonfire, the enemies of the world respawn. The world's hostility is renewed, restored to full. The bonfire does not make the world safe. It simply gives you a place to rest before returning to it. This is the most honest metaphor in the series. The world does not get better because you rest, and the enemies are still there when you stand up. The challenges that almost killed you are waiting in the same places. What the bonfire gives you is recovery. The ability to face those challenges again from a position of readiness rather than exhaustion. The bonfire is not a solution to the world's darkness. It is the practice of returning to yourself before going back into it. This is what the Dark Souls universe suggests about surviving, not winning, not solving the problem of the fire or the dark or the cycle or the hollowing. Just find the fire, rest, stand up, go again. The hollowing and what it means. Hollowing, the process by which the undead lose themselves through repeated death and loss of humanity, is the series' most sustained metaphor. It is not simply a game mechanic. It is the universe's statement about what happens to people who lose their purpose. The crestfallen warrior at the start of Dark Souls 1 has not hollowed yet. He still talks. He still has sardonic opinions. But he is hollowing. You can see it in the specific quality of his hopelessness, in the way he warns you that you will follow the same path without quite managing to believe that any path is worth taking. By the time you have progressed significantly, he has gone hollow and sits motionless. He did not die. He simply stopped having a reason to do anything. Hollowing is not death. It is something the series presents as worse than death. The continuation of existence after the thing that made existence meaningful has been worn away. The undead curse grants immortality, the specific immortality of being unable to stay dead, but it does not protect the soul from its own erosion. You can live forever and still lose everything that made living worthwhile. The inverse of hollowing is the state of having humanity, having the dark flame within yourself, the fragment of the dark soul, bright enough to sustain your sense of self. In game terms, humanity is a resource. In lore terms, it is the specific quality of being a person, of having enough of yourself intact to make choices rather than simply react. Every person who finds a bonfire and chooses to keep going rather than sit down and hollow. Every NPC who has maintained their sense of purpose against the erosion of the curse is demonstrating the most fundamental form of resistance the series depicts, not combat capability, not intelligence or magic, simply the maintenance of self in circumstances designed to dissolve it. What the Chosen Undead, the bearer of the curse, and the Ashen One have in common. None of them are special in the way that traditional fantasy heroes are special. The Chosen Undead's prophecy was manufactured. The bearer of the curse had no prophecy. The Ashen One was, by the game's own description, nameless, a cursed undead, unfit even to be Cinder. What they share is that they kept going. In a universe where the default is to hollow, where the specific gravity of the world pulls everything toward purposeless continuation, they maintained enough of themselves to act, to choose, to arrive at the kiln or the throne of want or the first flame, and face the question that the universe had been building toward. This is not presented as easy. The NPC quest lines throughout all 3 games are largely stories of people who could not keep going, who hollowed, who gave up, who made a terrible choice in a moment of weakness. Siegmeyer of Katarina, who begins as one of the most warm-hearted characters in Dark Souls 1, ends his quest line as a hollow thing that his daughter must put down, not because he was weak, because the world was harder than he was prepared for, because even genuine warmth and enthusiasm can be worn away if the erosion is sufficient. The protagonists succeed not because they are better than Siegmeyer. They succeed because they happen to maintain themselves long enough. And in this specific kind of world that Dark Souls describes, that is enough. That is sufficient. That is what victory looks like when victory is not defeating the darkness, but refusing to become it. The painted world as answer. The painter and her new world are the series' final image, and it is not accidental that this image is of creation rather than destruction, of warmth rather than fire, of something new rather than the continuation of something old. The Dark Souls universe spent 3 games asking whether the fire should be sustained or the dark allowed to come. The DLCs answer that question by declining to choose, by going to the end of both options, finding them both exhausted and consumed, and discovering in the ruins a young artist who has been waiting for the material to make something that is neither. The new painted world will be cold and dark and very gentle. Not the light of the age of fire, not the consuming dark of the abyss. Something that understands both and uses both and is defined by neither. A home for the forlorn. A place for those who have nowhere in the existing world to rest. The series does not promise that this painting will save the world. It does not promise that the cycle will end, or that humanity will finally achieve what Gwyn denied it, or that the first flame's fading will produce anything beautiful. What it shows is a small act of making, one person with paint and canvas and knowledge, doing the specific thing that is in her power to do. And it shows the Ashen One handing over everything that was gathered from the end of the world, the blood of the Dark Soul, the accumulated essence of what humanity has always been, to a girl who is going to make something with it. That is the ending, not a triumph, not a resolution, a passing on, what this world is for. Dark Souls is about the persistence of self in circumstances designed to dissolve it. It is about the specific act of choosing to continue when the world's default is to hollow. It is about the way that meaning is not given, not by prophecy, not by destiny, not by the specific cosmic forces competing for control of the first flame, but maintained through effort against constant erosion. Every bonfire you light is a statement. You were here, you rested here, you got up again. Every NPC quest line that ends in tragedy, and most of them do, is not a failure of the game's design. It is the game being honest about what the world is like for most people who live in it. The few who survive to help you, who maintain enough of themselves to offer something useful at the right moment, are not better than the ones who hollowed. They are the ones who happen to last long enough. The series does not offer comfort. It offers company. The company of a world that is honest about its difficulty, populated by beings who are trying in ways both admirable and pathetic, governed by forces that are neither good nor evil, but simply overwhelming. And it offers the experience of being, for however many hours you spend in it, the person who keeps going. The fire fades. The lords go without thrones. The unkindled will rise. And somewhere, in a cold world, at the end of everything, a painter is finishing her work. This has been the entire Dark Souls universe timeline, told slowly from the very beginning. From the age of ancients and the grey crags and the everlasting dragons. From the first flame and the Lord Souls, and the war that ended the age of stone. From Gwyn's fear and the witch's ambition, and the pygmy's patience, and the centuries of cycles and sacrifice and hollowing, and the very last question at the very last fire. Good night. The bonfire is here. Rest. You have earned it.